Is this some kind of joke? The young officer scoffed, stepping out of the cruiser. Her mirrored sunglasses reflected the sunrise, but the sarcasm in her voice cut deeper than glass. On the bike ahead sat Robert Bobby Langston, 82 years old, still a stone on his weathered 1970 Harley-Davidson. His back straight, hands firm on the handlebars, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The officers exchanged impatient glances. License and registration, sir. Step off the bike. Now! One officer's hand hovered near her holstered weapon. What they didn't know, what no one on that quiet Colorado street could have known, was that in exactly 15 minutes, the pavement would tremble beneath 12 military Humvees, and 50 armed soldiers would step out, looking for the person who dared to disrespect Colonel Robert Langston. Because this wasn't just any old man. This was a man who'd lived through 3 wars, trained a generation of U.S. soldiers, and still woke up every morning at 5 a.m. to run a farm by himself. And in this small American town, respect was about to make a comeback. Stick around. You won't believe what happened next. But first, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. If you believe real heroes deserve our respect, type honor in the comment. Before the flashing lights, before the standoff, before the 50 soldiers arrived, there was just Bobby Langston, an 82-year-old man who most folks overlooked. His farm sits 10 miles outside of town, nothing fancy. A modest white house, a barn that's seen better days, and fields he still tends himself. Morning starts at 5, Bobby once said. Sun waits for no one, and neither does the land. Every day, he slips into grease-stained overalls, makes a fresh pot of coffee, and steps outside. He checks the tractor, feeds the livestock, mends what's broken, always with quiet precision. The kind you only earn through decades of repetition, discipline, and duty. But Bobby isn't just a farmer. He's a Vietnam veteran, a former military intelligence officer, and a combat instructor who once trained young recruits on how to survive the kind of war you don't come home from unchanged. He served across 3 decades, Vietnam, the Gulf, Afghanistan. He holds 2 Bronze Stars, a Distinguished Service Cross, and 4 Purple Hearts, though he never talks about them. In the corner of his old garage sits a machine that's just as stubborn and enduring as he is, a 1970 Harley-Davidson shovelhead. Rust on the chrome, leather saddle faded. But when the engine growls, it still sounds like thunder. Bobby doesn't care for looks. The bike works. That's all that matters. It takes me where I need to go, he says. That's enough. At 82, his reflexes are sharper than most men in their 30s. His mind, clearer. His eyes, always scanning. That situational awareness, the kind trained into soldiers, never left him. But the world rarely notices that. All they see is an old man on an old bike. And that was their mistake. It was just past 8:15 a.m. Bobby Langston rolled to a smooth stop at the red light outside Cedar Grove Gas and Auto, the same station he'd been filling up at for 15 years. The engine of his old Harley rumbled low, steady and deep, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through Main Street. He sat upright, calm, focused, waiting on the light. Then came the flashing blue lights in his rear view mirror. A patrol cruiser pulled up behind him. The doors opened, and out stepped Officer Ava Reynolds, 28, mirrored sunglasses, crisp uniform, 3 years on the city patrol. Her partner, Officer Jordan Castillo, 30, followed behind with a slight grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. Reynolds approached with long, confident strides. "Is that thing even street legal?" she asked, her tone sharp, her smirk unapologetic. Bobby didn't respond. He didn't flinch. Hands on the handlebars, eyes on the horizon, calm as ever. License and registration. "Step off the bike," Reynolds added, one hand casually resting near her sidearm. Without a word, Bobby reached into his warm brown leather jacket and pulled out a neatly folded wallet. Inside, the documents were organized with military precision. He handed them over slowly. No rush, no panic. Reynolds glanced at the ID and blinked. 82? She muttered, almost to herself. "You don't think you're a little too old to be riding this thing?" Castillo chuckled as he circled the Harley. "Man, this bike's older than my dad." Look at all that rust. I'm surprised it even runs. Their laughter didn't break Bobby's focus. He sat still, posture firm, the same way he'd stood in formation decades ago, enduring worse things than smug cops and side comments. Hands on the bike, sir. Feet apart, Reynolds ordered. There was no threat, no resistance, no cause, but they began the search anyway. Not because it was necessary, but because they could. In their eyes, he was just another frail old man, a relic from forgotten time, too stubborn to quit. But across the street, at the gas station, someone recognized the truth, and he was about to make a call that would change everything. Word spreads fast in a small town. It doesn't take long before people start to gather. A few onlookers pause near the sidewalk, phones discreetly recording. A mother clutching her child's hand whispers, "Poor old guy." Others just shake their heads and mutter, "Probably shouldn't be riding at that age." Some are sympathetic, others judgmental. Officer Reynolds leans in again. "You live around here, sir?" "Farm, just off Highway 340. Bobby replies without turning his head. "Alone?" "Always." She exchanges a look with Castillo, the kind of glance that says, "Yep, another confused old man. You got family?" "Anyone who checks in on you. I've been taking care of myself for 82 years. Don't you think it's dangerous riding a bike at your age?" She presses. "You could cause an accident, hurt yourself, or someone else." Bobby says nothing. His silence isn't defiance. It's discipline, the kind that doesn't flinch under pressure. Castillo leans toward Reynolds. "I think he might be a little deaf too. Look at him, just standing there like he's somewhere else." Reynolds raises her voice sharply. "Mr. Langston, can you hear me? Do you understand what I'm saying?" The world, as always, splits into two, those who rush to judgment, and those who pause to wonder what story they've stumbled into. Across the street at the gas station, Frank Miller had been watching from behind the fuel pumps. 58 years old, Gulf War veteran, owner of Cedar Grove Gas and Auto. He wiped his hands on a rag, eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. He'd seen Bobby Langston dozens of times over the past 15 years. Always polite, always on time, always respectful. Never late on a payment. Never raised his voice. But now, he was watching that same man, someone he'd come to admire, being treated like a liability. Something snapped in Frank. He stepped into a small office, grabbed a landline, and dialed a number he hadn't used in over a decade. The Fort Carson Military Base. Fort Carson Military Affairs. "How can I?" "This is Frank Miller, Cedar Grove Gas. I need to speak with someone in command. It's urgent." "What's this concerning?" "You've got a veteran being disrespected by local police. His name's Colonel Robert Langston, 82 years old. Served this country longer than some of these officers have been alive. You need to get someone here now." The voice on the other end shifted instantly. "Did you say Colonel Robert Langston?" "That's right. Mr. Miller, please stay on the line. Do not let them move him. We're sending a unit now." Frank's heart pounded. For the first time, he realized a man who quietly filled up every Tuesday at Pump 4 wasn't just a veteran. He was something far more. "Hold the line. And don't let them lay another finger on Colonel Langston until we arrive." Back on Main Street, the interrogation had shifted into something uglier. Officer Reynolds stood inches from Bobby now, voice louder, tone sharper. Not out of authority, but out of uncertainty. "Mr. Langston, I'm going to need you to come with us. To the station." Bobby's hands were calmly folded behind his back, his boots planted firm on the pavement. His eyes hadn't wavered from the horizon. "And what for?" he asked quietly. "For inappropriate behavior and failure to properly respond to a law enforcement officer." She hesitated, then added, "You'll also need a medical evaluation. Mental, most likely, before you're allowed to operate that vehicle again." The crowd murmured again. Phones continued recording. Some eyes rolled. Some faces frowned. Bobby didn't flinch. "Based on what law?" he asked, steady as stone. Reynolds faltered. There was no law, no statute that allowed her to force a psychiatric evaluation based solely on age and silence. But now she was in too deep. The cameras were rolling. Her pride had taken the wheel. Elder protection protocols, she said stiffly. Behavior that puts your own safety at risk. A long silence. And then, for the first time in the entire encounter, Bobby Langston smiled. Barely, subtly, like a man who had heard far more dangerous lies whispered across enemy lines. Officer Reynolds, he said gently, how many years have you been in service? She stiffened. Mr. Langston, get in the vehicle. Now. I'm not going. Then I will use force if I have to. Frank Miller stepped out from his office. Wide-eyed, the ground began to vibrate. Everyone turned. Down the long stretch of Highway 340, they appeared. 12 Humvees, kicking up dust as they sped down the bend like a convoy straight out of a war zone. The sound was unmistakable. The military had arrived. The crowd parted instinctively. The patrol officers froze. The Humvees pulled up in a tight semicircle around the scene. Doors slammed. Boots hit pavement in perfect synchronization. 50 soldiers stepped forward with sharp precision. From the lead vehicle, a tall, broad-shouldered officer emerged. Steel gray hair, black Oakleys, crisp uniform with a chest full of ribbons. Captain Malcolm Trent, 55 years old, 22 years of active service. He walked right past Reynolds and Castillo and stopped exactly 3 paces in front of Bobby Langston. He stood tall, then snapped into a perfect salute. Colonel Langston, sir. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reynolds' mouth dropped open. Castillo blinked like he'd just been slapped. The word colonel hit the air like a detonated charge. Captain Trent turned slowly to the officers. We were informed there was a situation involving this man. Yes, Captain, Reynolds stammered. We stopped this gentleman because... Trent cut her off, his voice sharp enough to slice stone. Because what? Because you saw an old man on an old motorcycle. All 50 soldiers behind him took a single synchronized step forward, a wall of trained men and women, all staring silently at the officers. Trent continued. The man you detained served 3 tours in Vietnam, ran intelligence operations in Iraq, operated in Afghanistan. He trained officers, including me, in survival, combat, and honor. He looked Reynolds dead in the eyes. This man holds 2 Bronze Stars for Purple Hearts and a Distinguished Service Cross. He is a living legend in the United States Armed Forces. Reynolds stepped back instinctively. Castillo looked down at the ground. You just disrespected a war hero who gave 60 years of his life to the same country you claimed to protect. The phones were still recording, but now the tone had shifted from ridicule to reverence. The power dynamic flipped in an instant. Where there had been suspicion, there was now shock. Where there had been mocking smirks, now stood shamefaced silence. The 2 officers, Reynolds and Castillo, stood rigid, flushed with the sting of their own misjudgment. Cell phones were still raised, but the comments being whispered had changed completely. That's a colonel? I can't believe they treat him like that. What a disgrace. Those cops are out of line. Castillo opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it. Reynolds swallowed hard. She stepped toward Langston. Sir, Colonel Langston, aye. But he raised a quiet hand, not in anger, not in dismissal. Just enough to say, there's nothing you can say right now that will change what just happened. Captain Trent turned to his former instructor. Colonel, would you like an escort back to your residence? Langston looked out past the gas station toward the open road. No need for all that, Captain, but I do appreciate you coming. A slow, proud nod passed between the 2 men, not just soldier to soldier, but man to man. Respect, earned and acknowledged. Always, sir, Trent replied. We'll always be here. Langston walked back toward his Harley, parked quietly near the curb. He swung a leg over the seat with practiced ease. The crowd watched, breath held. He turned the key. The engine roared to life, not rusty, not broken, alive. The bike trembled beneath him like it had something to say. And then, something remarkable happened. All 50 soldiers, in perfect formation, stepped back and turned. They aligned shoulder to shoulder, forming a corridor down the street, a corridor of honor. He didn't need fanfare. He didn't ask for recognition. But on that morning, in the middle of a quiet American town, Colonel Robert Langston rode off not as a forgotten man, but as a remembered one. An hour later, the ripple of that morning's events reached the desk of Sheriff Doug Palmer, 52 years old, 15 years in office. Palmer had already heard whispers from his deputies, and then the call came through, direct from Fort Carson. Sheriff Palmer, this is Captain Malcolm Trent. Yes, Captain. I'm aware of what happened this morning. The sheriff replied, rubbing his temples. Then you'll understand why I'm calling. Captain Trent didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word landed with military precision. Colonel Langston doesn't want revenge. He's not suing. He won't press charges. Palmer exhaled in relief. That's good to hear. But Trent continued. However, as a military institution, we cannot and will not stand by while our veterans are treated like unstable liabilities in the streets they fought to protect. Palmer sat up straighter. What do you propose? A joint training program. Trent said, your officers will visit Fort Carson. They'll learn not just about military service, but about humility, judgment, and what it means to carry invisible scars. You want sensitivity training? No, Sheriff, Trent replied. We want understanding. By the end of the call, Sheriff Palmer had agreed. New departmental policies were drafted that very afternoon. Protocol for interacting with veterans. Guidelines on addressing elderly individuals in public. Field judgment and restraint procedures. The incident had sparked something long overdue. In that small town, respect for experience and service wasn't just being discussed. It was being written into law. And it all started because one man refused to step off his motorcycle. A few days later, Officer Ava Reynolds stood before her fellow officers. Not in defense, not in defiance, but in humility. She took a deep breath, cleared her throat. Last week, I made a serious mistake. I judged someone by his age, by his silence, by his bike. I forgot something essential. Every person carries a story, and I was wrong. No one interrupted. Even Sheriff Palmer leaned back in his chair, arms folded, quietly listening. Colonel Langston didn't just teach me about service. He reminded me that respect isn't automatic. It's not tied to uniform or title. It's in how we treat people, especially those we know the least about. The wooden house was simple, clean, freshly painted white trim, a porch with 2 rocking chairs, a field of wildflowers blooming under the late afternoon sun. Parked beside the barn sat that old John Deere tractor, and beneath it, boots sticking out from underneath, legs clad in grease-streaked coveralls. No press, no crowd, just one person trying to make something right. Ava stepped from the cruiser, took a breath, and crossed the driveway. Colonel Langston? The boots shifted. Bobby slid out from under the tractor slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was unreadable, but not unkind. Officer Reynolds. Sir, I came to talk, if that's all right with you. He studied her face for a moment, then nodded toward the house. Coffee's hot. Cups are clean. 2 blue ceramic mugs sat on the table between them. Bobby poured, handed her one, and sat without a word. Ava looked around at the walls, lined with faded photos, medals in dusty frames, and newspaper clippings yellowed with time. She hesitated. Can I ask you something? You can ask me anything, Bobby said, sipping his coffee. Why didn't you defend yourself? Back there on the street? Langston leaned back, eyes soft but clear. Because I didn't need to. Truth doesn't shout. It waits. A long pause. I spent decades teaching young men and women how to lead. And the first thing I told them is that respect isn't worn on a badge or stitched into a uniform. He looked her in the eye. It's shown by how you treat others, especially when you think no one's watching. That afternoon, Ava Reynolds didn't just leave with a story. She left with a lesson, one she would carry for the rest of her life. The Harley still runs. Its chrome may be faded, the leather worn, but every time the engine roars, it carries a legacy of a man who never stopped moving forward. Colonel Robert Langston still rides, down Highway 340, across the town that once underestimated him, but now salutes him. And somewhere between stoplights and salutes, that town learned something priceless. Not just about service, but about humility, dignity, and the quiet strength of unseen valor. Never judge someone by their age or by their appearance, because behind the wrinkles might lie a warrior. Would you have stood up for Colonel Langston? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful battles are fought in silence, and the greatest heroes ride alone until someone sees them.